Irakun was left fuming. He whirled around on the dais and opened his mouth as if to address the watching courtiers. Some, who did not support him, were smiling quite openly. Irakun clenched his fists at his sides and glowered. He glared at Divam Tovar and opened his thin lips to speak. Divam Tovar coolly returned the glare, daring Irakun to say more. Then Irakun flung back his head so that the locks of his hair, all curled and oiled, swayed against his back, and Irakun laughed. The harsh sound filled the hall. The music stopped. The laughter continued. Irakun stepped up so that he stood on the dais. He dragged his heavy cloak round him so that it engulfed his body. Cimmerl came forward. Irakun, please, do not. He pushed her back with a motion of his shoulder. Irakun walked stiffly towards the ruby throne. It became plain that he was about to seat himself in it and thus perform one of the most traitorous actions possible in the code of Melnibone. Cimmerl ran the few steps to him and pulled at his arm. Irakun's laughter grew. It is Irakun they would wish to see on the ruby throne, he told his sister. She gasped and looked in horror as Divam Tovar, whose face was grim and angry. Divam Tovar signed to the guards, and suddenly there were two ranks of armored men between Irakun and the throne. Irakun glared back at the Lord of the Dragon Caves. You had best hope you perish with your master, he hissed. This guard of honor will escort you from the hall, Divam Tovar said evenly. We were all stimulated by your conversation this evening, Prince Irakun. Irakun paused, looked at him, then relaxed. He shrugged. There's time enough. If Elric will not abdicate, then he must be deposed. Cimmerl's slender body was rigid. Her eyes blazed. She said to her brother, If you harm Elric in any way, I will slay you myself, Irakun. He raised his tapering eyebrows and smiled. At that moment, he seemed to hate his sister even more than he hated his cousin. Your loyalty to that creature has ensured your own doom, Cimmerl. I would rather you died than that you should give birth to any progeny of his. I will not have the blood of our house diluted, tainted, even touched by his blood. Look to your own life, sister, before you threaten mine. And he stormed down the steps, pushing through those who came up to congratulate him. He knew that he had lost, and the murmurs of his sycophants only irritated him further. The great doors of the hall crashed together and closed. Irakun was gone from the hall. Divam Tovar raised both his arms. Dance on, courtiers! Pleasure yourselves with all that the hall provides. It is what will please the Emperor most. But it was plain there would be little more dancing done tonight. Courtiers were already deep in conversation as, excitedly, they debated the events. Divam Tovar turned to Cimmerl. Elric refuses to understand the danger, Princess Cimmerl. Irakun's ambition could bring disaster to all of us. Including Irakun, Cimmerl sighed. Aye, including Irakun. But how can we avoid this, Cimmerl, if Elric will not give orders for your brother's arrest? He believes that such as Irakun should be allowed to say what they please. It is part of his philosophy. I can barely understand it, but it seems integral to his whole belief. If he destroys Irakun, he destroys the basis on which his logic works. That, at any rate, Dragon Master, is what he has tried to explain to me. Divam Tovar sighed and frowned. Though unable to understand Elric, he was afraid that he could sometimes sympathize with Irakun's viewpoint. At least, Irakun's motives and arguments were relatively straightforward. He knew Elric's character too well, however, to believe that Elric acted from weakness or lassitude. The paradox was that Elric tolerated Irakun's treachery because he was strong, because he had the power to destroy Irakun whenever he cared. And Irakun's own character was such that he constantly be testing that strength of Elric's. For he knew instinctively that if Elric did weaken and order him slain, then he would have won. It was a complicated situation, and Divam Tovar dearly wished that he was not embroiled in it. But his loyalty to the royal line of Melnibone was strong, and his personal loyalty to Elric was great. He considered the idea of having Irakun secretly assassinated, but he knew that such a plan would almost certainly come to nothing. Irakun was a sorcerer of immense power, and doubtless would be forewarned of any attempt on his life. "Princess Cimmeril," said Divam Tovar, "I can only pray that your brother swallows so much of his rage that it eventually poisons him." "I will join you in that prayer, Lord of the Dragon Caves." Together they left the hall. And so ends Chapter 2.